Hi everybody, Dr. Lee Coleman. Glad to have you back again. What I'm going to talk about this time is just sort of continue the evolution of what happened once this misguided system of how to investigate possible sexual abuse of a child, once it gathered momentum, more and more young professionals were getting the kind of training that the Giarretto program in Santa Clara County and the Key McFarland kind of methodology, and it was just an evolution of more and more workers, more and more programs set up, and the inevitable happened. You can't have a system like that without injustice resulting. And there would be no way to know which children were in fact abused and which weren't. So in Los Angeles alone, the greater Los Angeles area, there were at least a half a dozen preschool type facilities and daycare facilities where there were big accusations of multiple perpetrators supposedly, and those cases really never ended up in evidence that anything happened. Then you had big string of cases in Bakersfield, California, where it got so wild with the accusations growing, and I had a chance to study all those tapes and was involved in several of those cases. You had children who were eventually claiming that they had gone to barbecues and where the abusers, wearing robes and various kinds of cult paraphernalia, were committing murders, mass murders of various babies. I remember the one little boy who said that he stuck a knife in a baby and then passed it on to another child who did the same, and then eventually they barbecued the babies and ate them. And eventually children accused that the sheriff was one of the molesters, and the head social worker of Child Protective Services was another molester, and one of the district attorneys was also another molester. Well, you can imagine those kind of accusations would raise doubts even in the minds of the investigative agencies that were responsible for creating all this nonsense. And but nonetheless, many people ended up being incarcerated. Parents were losing their children. Some parents were sent to prison based on claims of what supposedly they had done. They would take children around, drive them. Somebody from law enforcement would drive them around the town and say, well, let's look for one of the churches where you said something happened. And they would drive until the child would finally say, I think it's that one. And they would go in and look around. Never found anything. Eventually, the Attorney General of the state of California decided, it's time to investigate what happened. Too many of these cases have fallen apart. Too many lives are being ruined. They spent over a year investigating, and they determined that these allegations had not happened in the Bakersfield community. And they found out the reason for why these wild and crazy things were being said. And it's exactly what I've been telling you. The California Attorney General, which after all is the highest law enforcement agent of the state of California, found that the reason why the children were saying so many untrue things was that they had been interviewed repeatedly in the most aggressive and suggestive ways imaginable, and that the children were learning to say things that their interviewers were encouraging them to say. Well, that happened even earlier in Minnesota. The Attorney General of Minnesota, Scott County, Minnesota, investigated what happened there. Another one of these allegations where there are supposedly groups of some sort of cult followers were supposedly committing group sex orgies with children, and none of it ever materialized. We had a wave of accusations against teachers in schools, in daycare centers and so forth. Eventually, Kenneth Lanning, who was the head of the FBI's behavioral science unit, studied this phenomenon of allegations of supposedly cult sexual abuse worldwide. And he eventually, despite initially being a believer, somebody who just jumped in without too much careful thinking, had to conclude there was no evidence for any of it. Across the world, there was no evidence that there were these pseudo-religious groups or some other kind of group with multi-perpetrator activity involving dozens and dozens of children with heinous acts of barbarity that supposedly were happening. It was all what I think anybody could have predicted, that if you begin to go to children with ideas in your mind and you question children in a leading and suggestive way, they will pick up the clues from you. They will do it in different ways depending on their age, how there's certain aspects of their personality. But the fact is that it's not that hard to convince a child to agree with what you already think. And that's the primary problem, isn't it, of what I've been telling you about with these other cases, that investigators go in with their mind already made up because of the kind of things they were taught by their trainers. You're going to have children say things which are not true. And then you won't even be able to do as good a job of catching those who have molested a child, bringing protection to the child and justice for society via the criminal justice system of penalties for perpetrators. So it was a terrible mess, and you could imagine maybe this could get even worse. Well, it did get worse, because the suggestibility inherently in human beings, the vulnerability of us all to suggestion and to groupthink, you might say, the malleability of human memory and the interplay between emotion and memory does not stop at the end of childhood. Human beings are suggestible till the day they die. It can change depending on where you are in your life. I've seen a pattern by studying so many hours of taped interviews, audio and videotaped interviews. I've seen a clear pattern that little kids, and I mean like say 3, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, they are easier to have memories created in them because they kind of go in and out of imaginary things anyway with play and so forth, and they can come to believe things which clearly are not possible. Many countless cases where I've seen that. And sometimes people argue, well, there's evidence that the children, once they get out past 6 years old, they don't have that suggestibility anymore. I've seen expert witnesses from mental health go in and talk about there being evidence for that. It's nonsense, because what can happen is older children are not going to say things that are clearly as impossible. They have enough intellectual development that they won't try to claim things that they can think are not real. But older children are quicker to pick up the clues as to what the interviewer thinks and what the interviewer is prodding them to talk about. So back to that McMartin case again, the children who said some of the most obvious untruths were sometimes the children who were older. They didn't need to be taken by the hand into the land of imagining something. They would realize that the pressure was on to have something to say about something bad having happened, and they would begin to talk about it. Well, let's move then to what happened next by the time we get to, say, the late 80s. We've been talking about, say, McMartin case was investigated starting in 83. It took 5 or 6 years before the last trial took place. So we're into the middle 80s. By the time you get to the late 80s, we had the development of what's been called the recovered memory phenomenon. And this is another bogus production of this kind of sloppy, biased thinking, something based on fads and people's willingness to entertain ideas which without a lot of really thought behind it. And that's where adults were the subject of manipulation and improper questioning and so forth. I think of a book called Secret Survivors by Sue Bloom, and she had what she called her survivor's checklist, and she as did the other people who were claiming that you could be the victim of sexual abuse and not even know about it. Now, in most cases up until that time, there was not a claim that you didn't know about it. It's just the claim was, well, you didn't talk about it. Now, we know that people who, in fact, have been the victims may well not talk about it. Anybody who denies that is really out of touch. How many thousands and thousands of rape victims, women, have been victims and not wanted to talk about it, or wanted to talk about what were not willing to talk about it? Does anybody doubt that that happens? Of course not. That's part of the experience of being victimized in that way. But this was a new claim that there were thousands of people, usually women, girls, whatever. The claim was that they don't know that they've been victimized because they repressed the memory of it. That was the claim, the repressed memory. So when I've studied cases like that, the whole issue is, well, is it that you just didn't tell anybody, or is it that you didn't remember it until such and such a time? And what in my own experience I always saw was that there was some intervention from the outside which was suggesting the possibility to them that perhaps the problems that they were experiencing, whether it was anxiety, depression, some other kind of sexual problem, some sort of other behavioral problem, they were being specifically asked, well, have you ever been a victim of sexual abuse? And if the answer was no, then the response from the therapist was, or the book, or the news magazine article, the response was, well, just because you can't remember it doesn't mean it didn't happen. You know, those memories can get blocked out. And a whole school of theorizing took place, began to develop. Trauma theorists, mental health professionals, whether psychiatrists, psychologists, so forth, began to develop a whole body of literature claiming that one of the problems with trauma is that you block out the memory. Now, up until this time, the people who were writing about trauma talked about the fact that the problem is not that you can't remember what happened, it's that you can't forget what happens. You have intrusive thoughts. You can, have ruminations and feelings which come back to you. You relive events. Just the opposite of the idea that you could have suffered a major traumas like sexual assault or sexual abuse and not remember it. So this new wave of therapy developed, the recovered therapy movement. Let me just read to you a few of the symptoms that Sue Bloom was advocating as the symptoms that could very well be the symptoms that you have been sexually abused. And therefore, the therapy would be all about to helping you recover the memories of the abuse and then work through the trauma of the abuse, and that would be the way you'd help yourself. I'll just, there's so many here, I don't want to try to read them all, but just for the heck of it, I'll start from the end and work my way up. Things like starting fires, being a prostitute, stripper, or porn actress, stealing, promiscuity, verbal hypervigilance, cannot be the sexual aggressor or must be the sexual aggressor. Limited tolerance for happiness, compulsively seductive or compulsively asexual. I'll skip over a few, move up to creating fantasy identities or feeling crazy, different, or unreal, or need to be invisible, feeling or demand to produce and be loved, phobias, self-destructiveness, drug or alcohol abuse, eating disorders, etc. An endless list of symptoms, all of which could be, according to this author, the trauma of sexual abuse trying to come out through a symptom. And what do? You come to therapy, and we help you uncover the memories. We do it by thinking about it. We think about how could it have happened, who in your life might have done it. Thinking, writing journals, going through crystal readings, you name it. Endless variety of therapeutic maneuvers to help you find the sexual abuse that you never knew about. And of course, people responded. You had people remembering things from an age in which nobody remembers. The brain has not developed. You cannot remember what happened at 1 year old. You cannot remember what happened at 2 years old. By most people's understanding, I think this would be pretty solid. 3.5 to 4 years old is the youngest age where you can have anything that could possibly be your actual memory versus a mental picture that you have gradually acquired from what you've heard, what you've thought about something, try to think back to something. So you had really thousands of people who came to believe that they were abused by somebody, and then, of course, part of the therapy would be to confront your abuser. I personally have studied many cases where the person who's accused now is the father, sometimes both parents. A grown daughter would be the most common pattern, where the grown daughter now, anywhere from her 20s to 40, 50 years old, is now accusing her parents of doing the most heinous things imaginable. And of course, a common pattern would be, not only can I not see you until you acknowledge what you did to me as a child, but you can't see the grandchildren either. And it's been, talk about trauma, very, very painful for grandparents to find out that they are not allowed to see their grandchildren. And many, many times the response has been to actually, if they want me to apologize. This is what grandparents have come to and talked to me about this. They want me to apologize, and I'll apologize. I didn't do anything, but if I did something that they think, I'll apologize. Well, that's pretty hard on them. I usually do not take it upon myself to advise them what to do. I don't try to encourage them to apologize, certainly, but I would never advise them against it, even though in my own personal worldview, to apologize for something you didn't do, I think is a terribly destructive thing. And if somebody wants my advice, I will tell them I don't advise that. But I don't volunteer that unless somebody does ask. But anyway, it's just a horrible abuse. And the Sue Bloom's book, as inappropriate as it was not the one that had such a big impact. It was a book called Courage to Heal. This book sold, I think, about 1 million copies. Two people who were not therapists, that is, they had no license to be a therapist. They probably were talking to people, but they basically wrote a book which I think it caught on because the title was a good title. It kind of makes you feel good if somebody says you got courage. If you accuse somebody of something and it says that's a courageous thing to do. That's kind of maybe hard for some people to resist. So you had a wave, usually women, usually accusing some male member, and heaven knows there are these things that do happen. We're all sad about that, and we don't want that to happen. But that's no excuse for encouraging people to claim that I've gotten back the memories and I never knew about it, but now I know about it. So again, along with my theme over and over again of asking you, think about it yourself. Do you think the kind of things that they are alleging, I mean, we're not talking about something minor. We're talking about like typical, repeated rapes, repeated sexual assaults with physical injuries. Do you think a person would ever would block that out? No. People who have been abused in major ways never forget. They may not talk about it. It's not too hard to imagine and understand why they wouldn't want to. And then it's appropriate when somebody has not been able to talk about something to offer them assistance. Nothing wrong. That's a good thing to do. But to encourage people to believe that they are recovering a memory, it's been discredited over and over again now, but nonetheless, it still happens. And it's an offshoot of this initial, very poorly thought out system that we've already been talking about a number of times. So, memory, I want to finish up just by telling you a little bit more about memory. Memory is not something that resides in one place in the brain. There's no memory center. There are some portions of the brain that are more involved with memory than others. The structure is called the hippocampus, and structures deep underneath the thalamus. They do have a strong function, but memory is not separated or walled off in any one part of the brain. Memory involves interaction with many other parts of our brain and therefore our mind and our emotions. Different parts of the brain are more or less involved with the emotional side, the intellectual side, the feelings, memory of past events. And memory is malleable. That's the most important message, is anything that can cause you to picture something in your mind can come to be felt as though it's a memory. That is, the person experiencing it will not be able to tell whether or not it actually experienced it or whether it's been created, or maybe it's partly experienced and partly created. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't trust anything that you remember. That's ridiculous. It's a spectrum. But it means that if you come into a suggestive environment where you want something to have been true, that can influence your memory of what is or isn't true. And you may not be sure eventually, but you may think you're absolutely sure. So in the legal system, what counts is a person being able to tell that you must promise, actually, when you're sworn in as a witness, part of being allowed to testify is that you have the ability to speak only from what you remember and not what you might have learned from what other people have said or what you might have hoped for. And there are standards that a judge is supposed to use to make sure that you only do that. And when we begin to come up with theories like recovered memory and like symptom checklists, and we have therapists which play footloose and fancy-free with trying to recover things, you have a potential for testimony in courts that is not reliable but can get missed, and someone can affect someone's life through the verdict, can affect children through how they feel about a grandparent or a parent. You have accusations that can be made. You have lives that can be ruined. You have a system in which sloppiness leads to tragedy. Thanks again for coming, and we'll see you next time.